This week, on Mind the Gap, there's a place in Ireland that exists for one reason only. Not to arrive, not to stay, but to move on. In this episode, Michael Comyn explores what happens when learning has done its job and why the best students, the strongest clients, and the most honest leaders all face the same quiet moment. The moment when staying becomes easier than growing. Drawing on the teachings of Epictetus and years of experience in coaching and leadership, this is a reflection on knowing when to leave well enough alone and when to leave entirely. Because sometimes the real work begins when the guidance stops. Here's Michael.
There's a station in the middle of Tipperary that doesn't quite belong to anywhere. Limerick Junction sits in flat farmland, between towns, between destinations. You don't travel to Limerick Junction, you arrive at it briefly on your way to somewhere else. It exists entirely and unapologetically for the purpose of changing trains. I've stood on that platform a few times, and I've noticed something about the people there. Nobody lingers. Nobody mistakes the junction for a destination. They check the board, they find the platform, and they move quickly. There's a lesson in that. There's always a lesson in that, but I want to come back to it. Epictetus was a Stoic philosopher who'd been a slave. He knew something about freedom that men who've always been free tend to miss, that it begins not with circumstance, but with attention, with the slow, disciplined practice of noticing what is yours to control and releasing what is not. He also knew something about teaching. Epictetus didn't want disciples. He was suspicious of the student who collected philosophy like furniture, arranging it carefully, polishing it occasionally, but never quite sitting in it. The ones who could quote him most fluently were not always the ones he trusted most. The ones he trusted were the ones who left. Not in anger, not in rejection, but in readiness. The Stoic school, properly understood, was always pointing beyond itself. The texts, the teachers, the discussions in the Stoa, these were scaffolding. Necessary scaffolding, but scaffolding nonetheless. At some point, the building had to stand on its own. That was always the design. The scaffold comes down. That's not failure. That's completion. I've been training coaches for a while now, and there's one conversation I find myself returning to with almost every new cohort. It's something like this. You'll work with someone, perhaps for months, perhaps longer. You'll sit with them in the difficult questions. You'll help them see what they couldn't see alone. There'll be moments of real progress, the kind that are almost audible when something shifts and you both know it. And you feel, quite naturally, the satisfaction of that. The relationship will matter to you, and it should. And then, if you've done your job, something will change. They'll arrive to a session and they'll know. Not because you told them, but because the work has found its own conclusion. The questions they're bringing you are no longer the questions they need a coach for. They're the questions they already know how to answer. Now, the moment is not a loss. That moment is the whole point. The coaches I worry about are the ones who can't feel that moment coming, who extend the engagement past its natural end. Not out of greed, not out of cynicism, but out of something more human than either of those. Affection, perhaps. The comfort of a relationship that has been good. The quiet reluctance to close something that has worked. I understand that reluctance. I felt it myself. But there's a gap here that's easy to miss, and it matters. The student who stays too long isn't always avoiding the work. Sometimes they're honouring the relationship. Loyalty and dependency can look identical from the inside. The question that separates them is one more people would rather not ask themselves. Am I still growing here, or am I just safe? It's worth saying this runs in both directions. The mentor who holds on too long is also worth examining. The teacher who remains indispensable, not because the student needs them, but because the teacher needs to be needed. There's a different kind of gap between the intention to serve and the instinct to remain central. The best coaches I know have a quality that takes time to recognize. They're genuinely pleased when someone leaves. Not relieved, not resigned, pleased. Because a client who no longer needs you is a client who has become more fully themselves. That was the contract, even if it was never written down. This podcast has spent 4 seasons in the company of the Stoics. Marcus Aurelius writing to himself in a tent on a campaign he didn't choose. Seneca composing letters about time while running out of it. Epictetus teaching from a room with no door to students he hoped would one day stop coming. They've been good companions, clear thinkers, uncomfortable in the right ways. But I've noticed something in the way I've been working lately. The ideas I'm reaching for, about intention and impact, about the gap between the behaviour we display and the one we'd choose if we were paying attention. They don't need the Stoic label to stand up. They stood up before I put the label on them, and they'll stand up after. The scaffold has done its work. We're keeping the gap. We're putting down the pointing stick. There'll be a pause before the next season. A deliberate one, not because we've run out of road. There's more of it ahead than behind, and some of its territory this podcast hasn't touched yet. But because the next thing deserves to be said differently, with a different set of questions, a different kind of attention. Next week is the final episode of Season 4. It'll be episode 82, and then a pause. We'll be back later in the year. The gap isn't going anywhere. Limerick Junction is not the destination, but it's where you change trains. Who would you be, and what would you do if you trusted that you've already learned what you came to learn? Mind the gap.
You've been listening to Mind the Gap with Michael Comyn. If this episode resonated, you might share it with someone who's ready for their next step, even if they don't quite know it yet. Michael's books, including Mind the Gap and The Next Station are available now on Amazon. And with the final episode of Season 4 coming next week, now might be a good time to catch up on the journey so far. Follow the podcast wherever you listen and join a growing global audience exploring the space between how we live and how we might live better.